Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well, and I hope you're going to spoil yourself and get yourself a lovely glass of effervescent champagne, or a glass of cold wine, or cold drink, or perhaps even a cup of hot coffee. Whatever it is you're going to get, go and get it, because I've got a fabulous story for you tonight, and it's going to warm the cockles of your heart. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is George, and I'm from a quaint little picturesque village in Derbyshire in England. And my Bigfoot encounter happened to me in the 80s when I was about 23 years old in Brazil of all places. I grew up with my parents and a brother called Walter, and we had a really phenomenal childhood growing up. We grew up in a world where crime was very uncommon, so as kids we were pretty much able to do as we pleased, without the interference of modern technology or nagging overcautious parents. My brother and I adored horse riding, fishing, and cycling, and we could be seen riding our bicycles all over the Derbyshire countryside. When we rode past our village in our bicycle down some of those long country roads, we would invariably cycle past exquisitely beautiful meadows, rolling green hills, and grazing fields of cows, sheep, and even horses. Our little terrier mixed dog called Mops literally followed us everywhere on those exciting adventures and never grew tired. I remember when I was about 10 years old, I was nearly killed by a herd of very inquisitive cows that could quite literally have trampled and stomped me to death. It would seem to be on this occasion that the cows had a probing curiosity and interest towards Mops, my dog, for some bizarre reason. Believe me, inquiring quizzical cows are highly problematic. Before long we were surrounded by cows everywhere that were closing in tightly on us and mooing. We were seconds away from being squashed and pounded to death, unintentionally of course by these creatures because their bodies are so large, and they could easily have flattened us in a heartbeat. I knew of a boy who had actually lost his life this way to a herd of trampeding cows. I knew I had to escape, and luckily I managed to squeeze under a fence and rolled through to the other side, with my body almost shredded to pieces by the barbed wire, and with a rather bedraggled, frightened Mops by my side. I was really shaken up by that incident, and even Mops became painfully wary of cows from that point on, and would simply refuse to go into a field if there was a cow in sight, and who could blame him? Believe it or not, I was once also attacked by a male billy goat, who had been placed in the field by the farmer to impregnate the female goats. Sadly, I wasn't aware of that at the time. I was accessing the hiking trail I was on through the field, which was legally accessible to all the hikers as a natural shortcut. I remember this creature literally pounded me with its horns so hard that my body was literally black and blue from bruising. I tried to escape this testosterone-driven billy goat, but he was not letting me out of his sight, and he was tearing after me and charging me, using his horns like deadly weapons. Finally, I was rescued by the farmer, who was killing himself laughing and trying desperately not to, because it was comical seeing his billy goat strutting his stuff like that. I hate to admit it, that the Derbyshire villagers could not suppress their amusement and laughter at my very sorry sight, and thought it was terribly funny that a male billy goat had seen me as a potential mating threat, as far as mating was concerned. When I went to the doctor, he was so shocked by how I looked and said, "I'll be damned, I've seen everything now." For some reason the male billy goat thought I was another male competing for mating rights, and he was having none of that. I promise you I've never been so beat up and bruised in my entire life. I soon became the butt of many jokes in the village. When I was a little older, my parents sent us to a prestigious boarding school because my father believed in the significance of a high-quality education to empower and enhance our lives. He was also insistent that we needed to have 3 skills in life, because he said that it would be an insurance policy for our financial futures. He felt that you could never ever be certain of the future, so 3 skills would set us up for life. I must say, I have never regretted following his stringent advice. So even though I was an aspiring medical student at the time that was desirous of becoming an orthopaedic surgeon, I had also developed the skills of being a barber and I learnt how to do that cutthroat shave to perfection at a local barber shop, and became so good at those clean-cut shaves that the barber literally begged me to work for him full-time. My third and final skill would be learning how to become a bricklayer, and so off I went to London to acquire some building skills. I remember how tough it was to get accommodation in London in those days, and you literally had to fight tooth and nail to get a bedsit. I would look for advertisements in the Evening Standard for accommodation, and invariably it would always have gone. Just my luck. It was maddening. There would be queues of people answering just one advert for a single room, so it was a living nightmare looking for affordable, cheap accommodation in London because the demands were so great. I want to tell you those greedy landlords in London were squirreling away monstrous fortunes, and if you were to complain about something, they would simply tell you could leave because competition for bedsits in London was exceedingly fierce. So in reality, they could literally get away with almost anything and offering you substandard accommodation. But beggars could not be choosers in those days, I'm sad to say. Finally, I was able to find a rather decent-sized bedsit in Bayswater, and as the building project I was working on was in High Street, Kensington, it was in very convenient location for me. The white building where I'd moved to was a classical piece of stylised, sophisticated architecture, but on the inside it was a very different story, as the place was quite literally falling apart, and even the staircases to the rooms were covered in threadbare carpets, and there was only one bathroom to be shared between 5 bedsits, which was absolutely ridiculous. I think the thing that shocked me the most was the electric connections in the rooms that looked so old and precarious you'd be forgiven for thinking that you could literally have a serious electric shock, and you probably could. So I decided that I would never be using an iron in that bedsit. Bayswater was metropolitan and was buzzing with people of all nationalities from all parts of the globe, and there was a great deal of Arabs in the area, wearing their typical white turbans and white loose clothes. In the building where I lived, there were some interesting characters. There was a young girl who was an upmarket cool girl and was visited regularly by her pimp. There were several bricklayers living in their bedsits who were working on local building site. And then there were many bedsits that were occupied by young girls from Brazil who were rarely staying in London for some life experience. And then there was a couple of Australian backpackers in another bedsit. I was enjoying my bricklaying experience, and it was physically strenuous and exhausting hard work, but I learnt a huge amount, and years later I was able to build my own house from scratch, so it was a massive advantage possessing another skill. My father was definitely right about that. One day as I was climbing the stairs to my bedsit, having returned from a hard day of work, I bumped into one of the Brazilian girls in our building, who was sharing a very large bedsit with 3 very friendly Brazilian girls, who invited me to join her for drinks at the local pub, and I thought it sounded like a fabulous idea. The pubs in London were always such a lovely way to relax after a strenuous hard day, and even enjoy a nice game of darts or two. To cut a long story short, I became very good friends with the Brazilian girl, who was called Anka, but it was not a romantic liaison by any strength of the imagination. We just became very close, firm and good friends, and before long Anka told me all about her life in Brazil and begged me to go and stay with her once she had left England and returned home. Once I had acquired my building skills, I returned home to Derbyshire, and my parents encouraged me to go travelling to broaden my horizons for a year or so before I pursued and completed my medical degree. Once again my father told me that travel was character building and good for the soul. He believed it was favourable and valuable to observe other cultures, faiths and lifestyles, and to learn from other people's life experiences. I did not need much encouragement because I loved travelling myself, and that was when I decided to visit Brazil and get reacquainted with Anka, who lived in a very nice neighbourhood in São Paulo. She lived in an upmarket white Portuguese home with seamless 1800s colonial architecture and a touch of neoclassic romantic influences, and it was spacious, open plan, and rarely cosy, well-designed home. It would seem that the garrulous and charming Anka had hundreds and hundreds of friends, and so she hosted numerous parties while I was there. I found the Brazilians to be very gregarious, friendly and congenial, and they just loved a good party and dancing to all hours of the morning. We visited pristine white beaches, and believe me, those beaches were among the most magnificent I've ever seen in the world, I imagine. I travelled all over Brazil, meeting some very interesting characters, and I enjoyed eating delicious Brazilian food. I noticed they love cooking with black beans in their dishes, but for me nothing was tastier than the picanha, which is a barbecued meat, and I was also rather partial to a feijoada, which is a hearty pork stew with black beans. One day Anka and I decided to go camping in a large wooded area of natural forest that consisted of luxurious vegetation, along with myrtle, laurel, palm, acacia, rosewood, Brazil nut, rubber, and Amazonian mahogany trees. After walking for a long while, we encountered a couple of sloths, and they were just so beautiful to watch, and they were hanging upside down and looking at us rather curiously, and it seemed that they were undaunted and unfazed by our appearance. We also encountered the most amazing birds, from the toucans to the parrots and macaws and hummingbirds, and as I've always loved birds, I was completely overwhelmed to observe such colourful birds. They were spectacular. I remember we were hot and sweaty, and we were being bitten alive by mosquitoes and other carnivorous-looking insects that seemed all too eager to eat us alive. Sadly, Anka had completely forgotten to bring any insect repellent with us, something that you should never do in the Brazilian forest. Some parts of the woods were so overgrown that we had to literally use a machete to cut our way through the forest, I kid you not. It was not long before Anka and I found a place to camp for the night, in a large open clearing beside a gushing pebbly stream that meandered and spiralled through the whole valley. It was very enchanting, magical, and terribly pretty, and we got the fire going to do our best to try and smoke out those obnoxious eating insects. It really was a sublime, enchanting evening, and the magical sounds of the forest were alive with the sounds of crickets and frogs, and there were other more intimidating roars and howls to be heard from animals that were clearly predators of some kind. Anka and I were feeling so much better as the smoke from our fire pit was successful in warding off those flesh-eating nasty bugs, and it was somewhat of a protection against predators, giving us a secure feeling of safety. There's nothing like a good fire to do that for you. We had set up a large tent in the open clearing, and we sat by our fire pit, talking and enjoying plastic glasses of cheap boxed red wine. It was such a bright, magical, cheerful night, with a golden white glaze from the full moon and silver sparkle from the twinkling stars, although there was a large canopy above us, that the light of the moon danced through the branches and lit up the entire clearing, quite brightly, I might add. Not to mention the light of the oil lamp, which also enabled us to view our map and discuss whereabouts we were to travel in the morning, because it is easy to get so lost in these forests, and so we needed to make absolutely sure we charted a reliable course for ourselves. I was lucky because Anka had a great deal of hiking experience behind her, as her father had once been a forest tour guide, so I knew I was in exceedingly safe hands with Anka's vast, invaluable knowledge of the Brazilian forest. Suddenly, before we knew it, we were surrounded, just from nowhere, by hundreds of monkeys that were eagerly rifling through our belongings to see if they could find any edibles. All our stuff was being flung all over the place. One of the monkeys opened our fruit bag and proceeded to eat a banana with great gusto, looking at us as if it was no big deal, while the other monkeys tried to tear the fruit bag away from him. But the naughty little critter held on to it for dear life and had absolutely no intention of sharing with anyone. Not in your life. He had an animated expression on his face, as if he'd most certainly won the food diving lottery. "Where on earth did they come from?" I asked Anka. "I think they've been watching us for quite some time," she said. "They're amazing at remaining invisible. We were trying to stop the monkeys from going through my backpack that was filled with all our food supplies for the next couple of days, but they weren't fearful of us at all, which was exceedingly frustrating. I tried to shoo them away, but with very little effect. Suddenly we heard the most terrifying roar that was so petrifying that it actually caused the ground to vibrate and shudder beneath us. We could literally feel the ground move. We heard these heavy bipedal feet thundering towards our campsite, and as they sprinted towards us, we could hear tree limbs breaking and tree branches crunching. It truly sounded like a trampeding elephant in musk was charging at us and rampaging through the undergrowth like a heavy bulldozer on full throttle. In terror, the monkeys just scattered. and I noticed that they seemed all too familiar with that sound, as if they knew what was charging us, and they had no intention of hanging around whatsoever. Suddenly standing yards away from us was this apex predator. I don't know how else to describe him to you. He was a monstrous giant, such as the likes that I have never ever seen before. The creature was literally titanic in its vast mammoth proportions, and was easily 9 foot tall, 900 pounds, and 4 feet wide. The first instinctive impression I procured from this creature was that it was a human giant, literally covered in dense, thick black hair, with the exception, of course, of the long grey face that was hairless and had a leathery but human-like appearance to it. This colossal creature was built like an army tank. It was burly, thick and muscular, and its overlong arms and human-like hands and feet were remarkably like humans, but so much larger. The creature barely acknowledged us, as his focus was on our large rucksacks. The critter pounded his chest a few times with his massive fists, and let out a thunderous roar, which I believed was designed to intimidate the monkeys that we had just seen, including the other forest animals, to affirm his high-ranking position, as I imagine king of the forest, which he most certainly was. We watched in absolute horror, and in awe at the same time, if that's possible, as this colossal critter glided towards our backpacks, rifling through them with jubilant enthusiasm like a kid emptying out a Christmas stocking. He looked exactly like that. The critter tossed the things that were of no interest to him at all over his shoulders like plastic plates and cutlery that went flying haphazardly into the air. Along went a book with him, a hairbrush, camera, binoculars, and they were literally scattered liberally all over our campsite. It was a massive mess. Finally, the creature came to our delicious food parcels, and he placed all the things he wanted in a very neat particular pile that included raw bacon pieces, cashew nuts, potato chips, a big block of sweaty cheddar cheese, biscuits, beef jerky, grapes, and plenty of dried fruit. He opened the box of red wine, took a sip, and spat it out in absolute disgust and revulsion, pouring it across the clearing, with all the contents sadly spilling out. Gone was all our delicious red wine. He then examined all the inedible items to see if anything was interesting enough for him to take, and nothing held the remotest appeal to him, I'm glad to say, so he discarded everything, including our freeze-dried food, which he tossed on the forest floor. He proceeded to pile our fresh food into my rucksack, and then he threw the rucksack over his gargantuan back, and this large rucksack, I kid you not, looked just like a handbag on his shoulders. It looked so small. It was in that moment that he looked up and gave a warning growl to us, much like a Rottweiler dog that guards his food. It was like he was saying, "This stuff is all mine. Don't even dream of challenging me." And then the creature just thundered away through the forest, barely giving us a second glance. But boy, did he leave behind a lot of shock. All the while Anchor and I had watched this creature, we were beginning to believe we were seeing things like the effect you might get from a psychedelic drug. I say that because until you've seen this creature up close and personal for yourself, you will only then comprehend how incongruous it seems in our natural reality. It really seemed so out of place, and yet it was larger than life, and real it most certainly was. We did not just see what I think we saw, I asked Anchor, who was shaking like a leaf, and her eyes had grown as wide as saucers. "So it's true," she said, looking absolutely dazed. "My father told me about the coal-black giant in the forest when he went on hiking trails, but I just thought he was trying to scare us. I had absolutely no idea it was true." "Your father told you about this critter?" I asked in horror. "Oh, yes," she said. "Believe me, I've got some stories to tell you that would make your hair curl. I just thought they were all spurious, but now I think they were true. I truly thought it was all fictitious stuff, but now I've seen the creature for myself, I'm in no doubt that he's real." As you can imagine, after meeting the coal-black giant in the woods like we did, my nerves were most definitely frazzled, as I have never been so frightened in all my life, and so I literally begged and pleaded Anchor to let us leave the campsite the following morning as that coal-black creature scared the living daylights out of me, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Looking back all these years later, I do realise we encountered a Bigfoot, which I am certain is equally as abundant in Brazil as in North America, only the locals are less inclined to talk about it, largely due to superstitious reasons. I'm still very good friends with Anka and speak to her regularly, and so I'm sure she will send you some interesting Bigfoot encounters from people who have encountered the beast themselves, and I'm sure your listeners will be very entertained. All these years later, that event is the most profound in my entire life, so I hope your listeners enjoyed my story. Oh, what an incredible story. I just love how things in life just seem to be meant to be. So until next time, goodbye and good night.